Hi, I'm Beth Strathman. Welcome back to my channel. There's a quote by the composer Debussy that talks about the music being in the space between the notes. And that quote has been in my mind for a couple of days, so I thought I'd talk about it today in this video and look at those spaces in between in our lives and the power that they really contain for us. For example, just for ourselves, there's the space that it happens between when there's an event that takes place in our lives and when we respond to that event or situation. There's a space that's created between the endings and beginnings in our lives. When one thing ends and we haven't quite started the new thing, there's usually a space there. And that space can sometimes feel uncomfortable, but it's really interesting and powerful. There's also the space that's created between two people even when you're interacting. Sometimes we don't focus on what's going on between us because we're so focused on ourselves or maybe what the other person is doing, but not the actual interaction and what's happening in that space between two people. So these are the kinds of spaces that I wanted to take a look at. Now, another word for these spaces in between is liminal space. And limen, L-I-M-E-N, comes from a Latin word which refers to a threshold, or actually the cross beam that goes across a door or a window. If you go back further to the Latin roots, it's this idea of liminality, or a lemon is about a boundary, a limit, or a border. So that's kind of interesting, to a boundary, a limit, or a border, when you think about that in terms of the space between places. Because certainly a boundary, a limit, and a border is really denoting that there is a change in the atmosphere. There's a change in the surroundings. There's some kind of, it's signaling that you're going from one place to another. In mythology, these liminal spaces, these spaces in between, are between the sacred and the profane. They connect the profane everyday world with the world behind the world that we can't see, but the world that contains all of the holy ideas and guiding eternal principles that we all live by, or strive to live by. And so oftentimes in mythological stories, you'll see in that when a character gets in an in-between space, they're in an adventure and they're kind of in this strange place where they're neither here nor there, you get different kinds of creatures that appear, like sprites and fairies and wood nymphs, and you get these strange otherworldly places where they find themselves in. And usually when they're in those places is when they have insight and gain new information about themselves and maybe whatever's going on in the story. Now, when we think of liminal spaces inside buildings, and going back to this idea of the root meaning of the word liminal, where it talks about it meaning the threshold at the bottom base of a door shows that we are moving from one space into another. It's a sign, an omen, a signal that you're leaving one space that may have a certain purpose and going into another. So the liminal spaces in buildings are things like hallways, lobbies, and stairwells. In our cities, liminal spaces are places like transportation hubs, airports, bus depots, train depots, where people are leaving home and they're held in this in-between state before they get on their train or their bus or their airplane to go off to some other destination. So these in-between spaces are transitory and they are transitional, and they signal us that we are about to leave someplace and leave behind something maybe old and move into a new place and perhaps have a new adventure. In your lives, there are different events that signal that you are moving from one place or in your life and going to a new place in your life. For example, graduating. Whether you're graduating from kindergarten, high school, college, trade or tech school, it doesn't matter. That graduation event is a liminal event, and it signals that, hey, you are no longer one thing, you're now another. You're no longer a kindergartner, now you're going to grade school. You're no longer a high schooler, you're going off to college. You're no longer a college student, you're going out into the world. So graduations, obviously weddings, when you're in between jobs. So sometimes you quit one job and you don't start one right away for a lot of different reasons. So you are, for a time period, whether that's even a couple of days or maybe it's a couple of years, you are in a liminal state. You're in a state in between jobs or in between ways of earning a living. And speaking of the workplace, when you're at work, sometimes your organization has a change initiative. So you're moving from one way of doing the work or being organized by department or division to another. And you know how stressful and awful sometimes those change initiatives can be, because when we're in those changes, we're in that liminal state where we are neither here nor there. We are sort of in transition from one way of being to another. And obviously, processes of getting divorced or getting married, when you go through those different kinds of experiences, there's a period where you're in this liminal state where you are either no longer single and about to become a couple, or no longer a couple and about to go back to being single. And so there's a transitory thing, there's a transition period where you are changing your status. And it can be very awkward, confusing, uncertain in those times as well. And even just moving to a new household, whether you stay in the same city or you're moving to a new city or a new country, there's you get everything packed up, and as you're moving, you're in this transitory state, obviously, but you get to your new destination, your new home, and you've got all these boxes, and it takes you a while to unpack and get settled. So for a period there, you're in a liminal state, a state of being in between, not quite rooted again in your new space. So these are all kinds of examples of just liminal experiences, these spaces in between that we routinely almost occupy during our lives, and we never really think of them. Oftentimes we dread them because they are unsettling, but we don't really appreciate them. And that's what this video is all about, is really appreciating them for the power that they do hold. So it's really hard to navigate these states in between, these spaces in between. And so that's why we want to get them over quickly. We don't want to pay attention to them very much. We just want to go from being at point A to point B, and can't we just skip all the, effort and exertion and uncertainty and all that this discombobulation that we feel as we're going through them. So the temptation, therefore, is to want to move through them very quickly, to get away from where we were and to move towards where we're going. In Greek mythology, the goddess Hecate or Hecate, two different pronunciations, pick the one you like. She was the goddess of these kinds of liminal places. A lot of other things, but really when you boil it down, that's where she really helped people out. That's what people would go to her for. She was the goddess of the night and crossroads. Crossroads being another liminal space where one needs to make a decision about which direction they're going. I'm coming from here, but now which road do I take going forward? Hecate was the goddess of the wisdom that helps us navigate these kind of liminal in-between spaces that we go through. And one of the symbols affiliated with her was a torch symbolizing the light that Hecate brought to guide the way. Hecate, with her light, reveals the transformation that we're going through and helps us to get there, to the new destination. She is the place of no time and no place. She draws her power from the space between heartbeats and between breaths. So those in-between spaces, see, more in-between spaces that you probably never thought about that are very important. So with all of these places, there's an ambiguous element to it, meaning neither here nor there, not one side or the other. So before we look really at the power of these spaces in between, I just want to call your attention to a quote by Viktor Frankl, who was in a Nazi concentration camp during World War II. And he's famous for the quote, and I'll just read it here for you. Between stimulus and response, there is a space, and in that space is our power to choose our response. And in our response lies our growth and our freedom. And so that quote leads me to my next real point or big category about these in-between spaces, or that illustrates these in-between spaces. And that is the space between an event that happens and our response to it. Most of the time, something happens in our lives, or someone does or says something, and if it hits a nerve with us, we act automatically. We don't even stop to think about it or to kind of take in what really happened or what the other person did or said. And we just automatically go into our fight or flight response, our threat response, and we react without thinking. And oftentimes that reaction is not us at our best, shall we say. Whatever your typical response is, probably not your best. And so the idea that Viktor Frankl highlights in his quote and from his experience is that in that moment between when something happens and we get ready to react to it, instead of reacting, if you take a few minutes, maybe a day, you take some time, you are going to be able to respond to what happened with more thought, perhaps more compassion, but to respond to it in a better way. So that in-between liminal could be a tiny second or two that you take control of your own reactability, and you can really reflect on what is an appropriate response, if any response is needed at all. That is, as he says, the key to our growth and our freedom. So that is the power of the space between stimulus and response, so to speak, is that you can take control over that space and really choose how you want to react or not. A second sort of broader category I'd like to highlight is this idea of the space between you and another, particularly when you are having an interaction. You know, our whole lives, when we're growing up, you know, through our school age years, into college, and even our early adulthood in the workplace, we are almost conditioned or trained to really pay attention to ourselves, which is not necessarily a bad thing. But we get so focused on ourselves and our own performance and our own wants, needs, and desires that I think it kind of trains us to be very centered on self when we are interacting with other people. So therefore, we don't pay attention to the space in between, what's going on in between us and another person. We're just maybe focused on ourselves, but we're not looking at that interaction, how the interaction is actually going. We get so focused on, well, this is the point I want to make, or this is how I need to perform in this particular situation. And we're not looking at what's being created in between us and that other person. So it's in that space where if we pay attention to it, that's sort of a liminal space, the space between two people, where there's a lot of creation going on. We're creating a meeting of the minds. And sometimes we might be creating a meeting of the minds and we're so focused on ourselves, we can't even see that. We can't even see our own assumptions, for example, that are being put into the interaction, or the other person's assumptions. We're not paying attention to that if we're just paying attention to the thoughts in our head and what our next response is going to be. So I think that the problem, the issue with those spaces in between, those liminal spaces, they're really underrated, at least in Western society and American society. We don't pay attention to them because we're just so fixated on getting from A to B and forget about the transition. I just need to hit the ground running in my new situation or whatever. But because we underrate them, we don't really get out of them all the wisdom that we could be getting from them, all the knowledge about ourselves that we could be extracting from these liminal spaces between. So even though it's awkward and uncomfortable and hard to be in these spaces, regardless of if it's the space between stimulus and response, the space between you and another person in conversation, or the space that's created when you're moving from one state of life to another, there are some things you can do to really take advantage of these spaces in between and really realize the power that they can have for you in really knowing yourself better and extracting all the wisdom you can from these opportunities presented to you in these spaces. So here's some things that are often helpful to do when you're in a liminal period of time or a liminal place. One of the things I think that's hardest for most people, it's certainly more difficult for me, is to not think you have to do so much. Just rather be present and be aware that you are present. This is very hard because what's the thing, even when you're waiting for a bus, or waiting for anything, what do you instinctively do today? You grab your phone and you just are on your phone and you're just scrolling. You have to have some kind of activity to keep yourself distracted or your mind engaged or not engaged, however that works when you're scrolling. But, and it's much harder just to sit or stand and be and just observe what's going on in the world. Just observe people, observe yourself. You could even just meditate a little bit. You don't have to close your eyes, but just kind of be present. Harder to do, but that is probably a fairly productive thing you could do when you're in these kinds of states. Same thing, and I would say the same thing if you're thinking about time when you're in conversation with somebody else. Sometimes the wisest thing you can do is simply be present and be listening to the other person, obviously, but also be aware of what's going on between the two of you, and not be trying to come up with your next response in your head. And along with that, you can be tuned in more to your own inner guidance. When you are in these liminal spaces, you can open up to other perspectives. So, you're between jobs, let's say. Maybe you don't have another job to go to yet. You're trying to figure that out. This is a great time to be open to other people's perspectives. In conversation, obviously being open to other people's perspectives is a good use of that liminal space in between. The power of being in these liminal spaces is, of course, that it opens you up to having insight, inspiration, glimpses of creativity, and oftentimes, using these awkward in-between stages can often lead to coming up with creative solutions to problems that can lead you in new directions. These being in these in-between times too is a great way or a great time to experiment and try new things. So going back to the job analogy, for example, if you're between jobs and you're not quite sure what your next job will be, or even if you do, it could be a great time to kind of experiment and try out some new things. It could be trying out a new job, right? You can do temp work, or you can talk to people about their jobs, or you can experiment with other kinds of things in your life. While you're figuring out what you want to do next, you might take up art, whether it's painting or sculpture or pottery or something like that. It's a good time, because you're neither here nor there, just to do something that kind of gets your creative juices flowing. It's also a time that you can take risks that you wouldn't normally take if you were settled in either one situation or another. When you're in these spaces in between, you can obviously take risks according to your own ability to tolerate risk, but it's a great time to do that, because, hey, why not? You're not confined by being in one state or another. And when you take these risks, whatever failures or mistakes you make, there is less judgment, right? Because you're not in a fixed state on one side or another of these states in between. You're in a state where taking those risks is more permissible, and there isn't going to be somebody saying, well, you just did that wrong. Well, I meant to try this out. I didn't know if it's going to work or not, so I'm just learning from it. So you get the chance to learn from your failures and mistakes, which can again lead to more insight and wisdom about maybe where your future lies and wherever you're moving towards. And the final thing I'm going to say about the power of being in these liminal in-between states is that it helps you gain wisdom about yourself, so that you understand yourself better, and you can often figure out what you want to keep and what you want to let go of in terms of who you are and how you've operated in the world. And this can be true when you're in a lot of different kinds of in-between states. Jobs, relationships, when you're in the middle of a conversation with someone and you realize something about yourself. So those liminal spaces give you just enough elbow room that if you take advantage of it and you are aware of the fact that it is there, you can really benefit yourself from the powerful things that can come out of these in-between spaces. So in short, the power of being in the space in between is really this idea of breaking with the past and preparing yourself for a different and hopefully better future, that you can make it better because of the awareness you're bringing out of the in-between state, that you can build into the future that you create for yourself. So don't despair when you get into these awkward in-between states in your life. They are awkward and they're uncertain, and sometimes that's kind of freeing. But acknowledge that, this is the space between. So let me take advantage of it. And it's really a great time to go inward and figure out more about yourself and where, what you really want and where you really want to take yourself in the future. After all, as the composer Debussy actually observed, it's the space between that makes the music.